Hey guys, it's Coach Sane here, and this is going to be the first video in a three-part video series which will explain the overview of FTC and the technical knowledge that you'll need to design, develop, and build a competitive FTC robot. So in this first video, we're going to be explaining the game of FTC. Basically, how you would approach this game, what defines the game, and some of the things you need to know from past seasons that can help you this season. In the rest of the video series, we're also going to give you an explanation of what it takes, the steps it takes to build a competitive FTC robot, as well as some of the time management and strategy tips in the final video. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be explaining the FTC game. The FTC game is extremely important to understand, and many teams will rush into designing or building a robot, but not fully understand what the requirements are. So whenever you kind of have a challenge, you need to understand what goes into that challenge, and that's why in this video we're going to be explaining the game in and of itself. So there are a few things that define the game. The first thing is obviously the field. The field is basically the platform that teams will use to play the game. The field is basically 3.66 meters by 3.66 meters, so it's quite large. You can kind of visualize this as if you take 5 or 6 steps one way, 5 or 6 steps the other way, that's the entire field size. The field is made up of two things. There are field walls, which is this hard, really tough surface that robots can ram into, and that closes off the field. Inside the field, there are these soft tiles. So these are like foam tiles you might find in like a gymnasium. And basically what these are is when you put the robot on, it can drive around these tiles and it doesn't damage the wheels. So it's a soft tile with hard walls that basically encloses this field. So you're probably thinking that is a very big field. You can probably fit, 15, 20, 30 people standing. Why is there only one robot? Well, the thing is, at competition, there isn't just one robot. 4 robots will play a game at a certain time. And within these 4 robots, there are 2 alliances. So just to explain, there's a red team and a blue team. And each team has 2 teams within them. So 4 in total will play the game. You might be paired up with your alliance partner. So let's say you're on the red team. You'll be red team on the left side and there'll be a red team on the right side, and you'll line your robots up. Your team needs to collectively score enough points to then win the game. Whereas if the blue team scores more points than your team scores, then they win the game. So FTC is a teamwork, catered game. You might individually build your robot, but when you go to competition, almost every single match you're going to be paired up with another team, and you need to dynamically work with that team. This is one of the things that makes FTC extremely different to FLL, because in First Lego League you kind of go onto a table. There might be one mission that's a shared mission, but the rest of the kind of tasks are individual. So as long as you've programmed your side of things, your scores are independent. Whereas in FTC, you could rock up to a match, and let's say you've designed a really, really good robot, and the team next to you is still developing their robot, maybe things aren't working. If you're playing the blue side, let's say there are 2 really, really good robots, you might seem to think that this is unfair, but that's kind of the game. And you'll play 5 qualification matches, and your partner will be different for every single match. So for one match, you might be playing with someone. The next match, they're on the blue side and you're playing against them. So this is one of the things that makes FTC really fun as well, because there's a lot of unpredictability, and yeah, it's a challenge at the end of the day, and it's a lot more competitive than what you might find in FLL. So just a quick note on qualification matches versus playoff matches. Qualification matches, your alliance partner is randomly assigned. So you don't actually know who you're going to be playing. Usually in qualification matches, there are 5 or 6 depending on the size of the tournament. So you'll play 5 or 6 of these matches or games. At the end of each match, you'll either win, lose, or draw the match. So it's quite rare to draw the match, but basically the idea is for every match you win, you score points in order to rank yourselves. So it's basically like a soccer tournament where the more matches you win, you get 2 points for winning a match, you get 0 points for losing the match because the other team scored the 2 points for winning. And if you draw the match, then each team gets 1 point each. So you play 5 of these matches. If you win all of your matches, in the end, you have what's called 10 ranking points. Ranking points are exactly what they sound like. They basically rank every single team so that when you end all your qualification matches, there is a breakdown of the robots or the teams from top to bottom. If you lose all your matches, you'll be on 0. If you win, you'll be on 10 or 12 if there's 6, because 6 times 2 points for every match. And there'll be a lot of teams in between who might be on 2, 4, 6, 8, depending on how their competition goes. So there are qualification matches, and then there are playoff matches. In qualification matches, like we said, it's randomly assigned who you're working with for all 6. So you might be working with someone, and then the next time around, you're not working with them, you're against them. Whereas in playoff matches, you're basically given the opportunity to select one partner if you're in the top 4 or top 6, depending again on the size of the competition. So let's say you won all your matches, so you're first or second. Basically the way it works is you can then select your team. And the first team will select a team, the second team will select a team, and so on and so forth. What usually happens is the first team might select the second team, and then the third team might select the fourth team. Then the team that was 5th can go on to select another team until there are 4 alliances, or if it's a bigger competition, 6 to 8 alliances as well. In playoff matches, you just stick with the same partner. So now it's basically who's going to win the entire competition. So broadly speaking, when you go to competition, there'll be 2 sides of the competition. There'll be the qualification side, which is the start of the day, and then the playoff side, which is the end of the day. Not every team will play in the playoffs, unfortunately, because it is designed to eliminate certain teams in order to decide or, give a good determination of who the top teams are. But at the end of the day, it's all about doing your best, right? So even if you don't make playoff matches, that's completely fine. You can still progress to future competitions and work on your robot throughout the season. Okay, so now we know how big the field is. We also know how many teams play in it, and we have an understanding of how matches work and how alliance partners work. The next thing we need to understand is the game in and of itself. So an FTC game is 2.5 minutes. It's actually exactly like First Lego League in terms of time. The thing that differs is how the game is laid out. Again, this might get a little bit complex at the start, but I'll put up a diagram to help explain this. The first 30 seconds of the 2 minutes and 30 seconds is going to be autonomous. Or in other words, you're going to press a button on your robot console, and then the robot will move by itself. And it will move by itself and do a number of tasks that you've programmed it to do from beforehand. So the first 30 seconds, you'll have 4 robots moving independently, but not all of them may move depending on if they have an autonomous program or not. Now moving on to the 2 minutes of driver controlled. This is where you'll change your program on the console or on the driver hub that you have. And basically what will happen is you'll have 2 drivers. You can have 1 driver if you so choose, and they will drive the robot around like it is a remote control car. Or in other words, they're playing like a normal game. So imagine you're playing a VR racing game, but instead of it being virtual reality, it's a real game with 4 robots on the field. You're in charge of your robot, and the driver will basically, do certain actions based on what you've built the robot to do. So we usually call the first 30 seconds auto, which is short for autonomous, and the 2-minute part is called teleop. This is short for teleoperated, or like driver controlled is another substitute that we might use. Okay, so now we've gone over the field, we've gone over how Alliance works, and also like the time of each game. Now it's how do teams win, and it's fairly straightforward. Usually I've explained ranking points, which is how the end of the match works. From now on, when I use the word points, it's going to be the points that you get in the match. So the FTC Field is made up of different challenges, and you can complete tasks with your robot either autonomously in the first 30 seconds or with a remote control, with a driver control period, to score more points in the final 2 minutes. And every task that you complete will give you points in the match. So as you do more and more and more tasks, you'll get more and more and more points. The team with the most points at the end, it'll be calculated. Again, when I say team, I mean your team plus the team you're allianced with. So collectively together, once you finish your match, you'll have a red score and a blue score. The alliance, I should say, that wins the match ends up getting 2 ranking points. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the detail of what an FTC game is comprised of, because we've understood the facts of what an FTC game is, but now some of the specifics. An FTC game is extremely repetitive. In First Lego League, if you've done that competition before, there are usually 13 missions out on the field, and a robot will go around and complete each one by one by one. This is not repetitive at all, because typically a team will do, 8 to 10 or even all 13 missions within their 2.5 minute game. In FTC, it does not work that way at all. Typically, there's, 1 or 2 tasks that score you points, and that task may only take you 20 seconds to do. Or if you're a really good robot, it'll be less. So within the first 20 seconds of the match, you'll do the task once. And then there's nothing else for you to do, but you can do the task again, and then again, and again, and again, and again. FTC is a repetitive game. If you can do the task fast enough once, then you have to repeat that process over and over and over and over again, and that's how you score points. Now, when I said there were 1 to 2 tasks, that is true, but every game it changes. We're going to go into what makes up a game a little bit later in the video, but in like what you should take away from this part of the video is that FTC is really repetitive. It's a cycle game. What cycling means is when you do a task once, that's one cycle. So let's say you grab the garbage from your house and then you take it to the bin outside, you put it in the bin, and then you come back inside. You've done one cycle. Let's say you do this 5 times or 6 times. For some reason you have a lot of garbage in your house, I don't know. Every time you do this, you score more points. It's the same task that you're doing. At the end of the day, you're picking up the garbage and you're placing it outside. But the faster you do it, the more likely you are to win the match, because there are 2 robots on the other side who are also doing the exact same challenge. So if you can do something in 5 seconds or 6 seconds, and the other team, it takes them 20 seconds to do it, over a 2.5 minute match, your frequency or the number of times that you do that action is going to be significantly higher. That's a really big advantage. When I say 5 seconds versus 20 seconds, a lot of the time it's not going to be like that. The matches will be quite competitive, and robots are usually, there are always robots that are extremely, well designed and optimized, but a lot of the time at, qualifiers or even at nationals, the robots aren't going to be, amazing, right? You're going to be competitive if you have something that's functional and fast enough. Now, a question that you probably have is, what do you actually have to do? Like, we've explained a lot of the basics, we've explained even like how repetitive it can be, but what's the action that's going to be done by a robot? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and actually it's going to be different which year you're actually going to be watching this video in. Every year, a challenge is released, or in other words, the season drops. When the season drops, the game comes with it. That's typically what is released. Teams will really hyper-focus on this game. In FTC, it's usually announced at the start of September. So September 1st was a date. In previous years, it's also been on September 4th. It changes year to year, but early September is definitely when it's going to be. On September 1st, your team will find out through a video what the game will be. Each year, the game is different, but fundamentally, in terms of what makes up the game, there are a lot of common traits between each games. All of the things that I've just discussed are in much further detail in the competition manual, and in fact, a lot of the things that I might have said have much more added complexity to them. For example, I explained qualification matches and playoff matches. I didn't explain what happens in between. There is something called alliance selection. Now, I could go on probably for hours explaining the FTC game, how the competition operates and what your team needs to do to, understand how that works. The reality is, not everything is important to understand in FTC at the start. As a team, you're going to experience a lot of different and unique things, whether you're a first year team or if you're coming back in second and third year. You don't need to fully understand the process of, for example, alliance selection, because you will experience alliance selection when you're at competition. Understanding that process isn't actually that valuable from now. It can be useful, but there are other things in FTC that you need to know and understand that are more valuable to understand, which is why I've skipped over certain things. if you really want to understand everything, you should definitely read the entire competition manual. And like I said, it's very, very difficult to read, a 60-page document, but it's not difficult for each member of your team to read 5 or 6 pages over maybe 2 or 3 weeks. So if you kind of divide and conquer, you'll be able to understand all the sections of the FTC game, but a lot of teams choose not to do this. If you're a rookie team, or even if you're a second or third year team and you realized at competition that your robot was not legal when you went, that's because your team probably hasn't read the robot construction section. So the robot construction rules are very specific and set defined rules on what your robot needs to be able to pass, or certain, it's called, scrutineering or inspection. They will go through each part of your robot according to a set rubric and criteria, and if your robot fails one of these, your team will need to fix it before you can play a single match. FTC, you're building robots the size of a microwave. There's a fairly sizable battery that you'll use, and you're also dealing with mechanisms that can and potentially would cause harm if you don't follow the rules, especially the safety rules. So make sure you go ahead and definitely read the robot construction rules. They may change the wording of this slightly from year to year, but it's always going to be, safety rules, game-specific rules, and then general rules as well. So the plan for this video is to release it at the start of 2025. So we have no idea what the actual 2025 game is going to be, because that's going to be released all the way in September, and this will probably be posted in February or March. But we do know what 2024 is going to be. And in fact, we know all of the past games from 2024 all the way back to when FTC started way back when. And we're going to use the past few games, or actually the past 5 games, to learn and pick up and give your team the necessary skills to predict, or at least get started on how to understand what an FTC robot might look like when you make the game, or when you compete the game, either this year in 2025 or in the future, whether you're watching this in 2026 or 2027 or further on. Okay, so as we explained earlier, every year the game will change. And in order to determine what you might need to do in the future, we can look back to past games to learn from those games, how they worked, how they operated, and make some determinations and maybe make a plan for what to do. Every year, there are 2 types of things that make up a game. There are game elements, which is what you see in front of you. Game elements are quite random looking objects that we're gonna go through very soon. And basically these game elements are kind of like the ingredients that make up the game. On top of the game elements, there are usually also structures. So these structures are quite large and they populate the field. The structures typically define where the game elements need to go, where the game elements start, and kind of how it works in terms of the overall operation of the game. Now, what we're going to do is start with the game elements from the past 5 years. So you can see on that right-hand side over there, that's 2024/2025, the latest into the deep season. And we're going to go through all of these one by one and kind of generally explain what we can learn from them and how game elements change year to year to year. Okay, so we're going to start with 2020. Now, in terms of this naming convention here, this is the name of the season. So if you want to search up FTC Ultimate Goal, you'll learn about the game. But also, this is the date the season was released. So 2020, September, because that's when kickoff is. And then this 2021, basically what this shows is that the game was released in 2020, but the last competition, or the World Championship, that's usually like the international, the highest level, that's usually held in April of 2021. And then there are also off-season or premiere events that kind of are conducted throughout the end of 2021 up to the next September of 2021. So that's why these numbers are the same, but this is really the number that defines when the season is released. I'm going to start with these 2 seasons because they are quite different. This season, Ultimate Goal, there was basically this foam ring. So this ring is quite flexible, you're able to bend it and shape it in any ways, and it restores back to this almost donut-like bagel object. So in this game, there were these rings, and that's it. Like, there was nothing else in terms of game elements. All the robot needed to pick up was this. So in this game, robots needed to collect these rings over here, and then to score points, they needed to essentially shoot them into a structure. The structure had 3 tiers, and if you could shoot them into the highest one, that's the most amount of points. If you shot them into the middle or the lowest one, then you got different levels of points as well. So now you understand like what needed to happen in this game. There's one more important thing in addition to game elements. So there's game elements, but there's also possession limits. That may sound a bit intimidating, but all it means is how many game elements are you allowed to carry at the same time? Or probably a better explanation is how many are the robot allowed to carry? So in this game, you are allowed to basically, let's say there are these 3 elements right here. The robot comes and scoops this one up. You could also take this one and this one at one at a time. So like you could take 3 at a certain amount of time. So we define the possession limit in this game as 3 rings. This possession limit is quite important because let's say there were these 3 rings kind of here, and then you needed to shoot them way over there on that side. You could kind of pick this one up, and instead of going and shooting it, you can also pick this one and this one up all at the same time, then traverse to where you need to shoot them off, and then come back and repeat the cycle. So the possession limit is quite important because you really want to be maximizing how many elements you hold according to the rules. In this game, if you were to hold 4 elements at once, you would immediately get a penalty. So that was 2020. Now let's do 2021, which is probably strangely a little bit more unique. Now in this game, the possession limit was 1. But as you can see, there are 3 kinds of elements here. There's this cube, which has little cutouts in it. There's this wiffle ball, kind of like a baseball or something that resembles a baseball. And here you have a cute rubber duck. Not quite sure where this came from, but that's what they came up with. These were 3 quite legitimate elements. In the game, you had a bunch of these. So you had like 20 of these, 20 of these, 20 of these, and they were all stacked into one area of the field. The robot was then allowed to only pick up 1 of them. So you were only allowed to pick up 1. The possession limit was 1. And then you had to go and place it into a structure. The structure was kind of like a big, there's no other way for me to explain it than like a cake tier. So like a 3-tiered cake stand where you put little cupcakes or different things. And you had to put, it was massive though, and then you had to put this onto the cake tier. Again, there were tiers, so the higher you put it, the more points you scored, so on and so forth. Hopefully you're starting to see a bit of a pattern with how structures work and how heights can change from year to year, but the idea is the same. One more thing with this is you can see these are the same, except there's these little weights in here, and there were actually 3 kinds of cubes that game. So there were these 3. This is significantly heavier than this one. So that's basically how that game worked. But the overall geometry was the same. So you could pick this one up the same way you pick this one up. Your robot just had to accommodate for different weights. Yeah, this was a little unique trick they did. And they will do this from game to game to game, depending on like how complex they may want it to be. If you're kind of thinking about a robot and how a robot might operate, you probably immediately think picking up one of these rings in 2020 was hard because, it was low to the ground and you had to pick it up. That being said, you can see it's a very foam-like material, so there's more grip here. Picking up this ball was actually, actually you can see immediately as I did it there, picking up this ball was a lot harder than picking up this game element here, only because of the plastic-like material. The overall geometry, so the size of it, is a little bit nicer. It fits nicely in the palm of a hand and it allows you to grab it from different angles. But the plastic-like nature made this one a little bit more difficult to pick up than this one, because you can immediately see like picking up and dropping this one, it's actually very, it stays in your hand. This one over here, it's extremely soft, like in terms of it's extremely smooth in terms of how the plastic is made. And same with this one as well. That was one challenge. The other challenge you can probably imagine is the different size. Like this cube is very, very different to this sphere, which is very, very different to whatever shape. So there's a sphere here, and then there's like another ovaloid thing here. It's a dove. But the idea is, when you look at the game element, you're looking at the geometry. This is, at the end of the day, a plastic smooth cube. Picking it up and then using the same mechanism to pick this one up, that's going to present a challenge. And that was actually the challenge with this season. It's called Freight Frenzy, so they designed it around the freight. The challenge of dropping these objects off was fairly straightforward. Like, you can imagine in your head, if you pick this up, putting it into the tier was quite simple. But picking up all three efficiently was the real challenge of this season. So now we're going to move on to these two games over here. So we have 2022 and 2023. These elements are now colored. This is the first time we're seeing this, but it does happen occasionally. Not all the time, but it happens sometimes that they will make it very clear that this game element here is for the red alliance, and this game element over here is for the blue alliance. If the blue robot tried to pick one of these cones up, they would get a penalty or a foul. I may say penalty, I may say foul. In 2024, they changed the word penalty to foul. Basically, the way penalties work is you give extra points to the other team when you get a penalty. Yeah. Now, this game, PowerPlay, probably one of the easiest games to explain, and definitely it was a unique game because in all of the other games that you might see over there, they're a little bit more challenging, like we said. Like, shooting was immediately unique. Having three different elements was immediately unique. This game was actually extremely straightforward to understand. The field was pretty crazy. I'll put a picture of it here. Basically, there were the poles. There are three kinds of poles. There were low poles, medium poles, and high poles. And basically, the idea was that the Red Alliance had to pick up these cones. After you picked up a certain cone, the possession limit was 1 for this season, so you can only pick up 1 at a time. You basically just have to score it on the poles. The poles, again, different heights represent different point values. So if you put it on the low pole compared to the high pole, you get different points. You can then stack different poles, like stack these. So imagine this was red, on top of another to kind of build up certain points. The challenge in and of itself was very, very simple. It was the typical standard pick and place game. Pick and place just means you pick up the object and you place it. The unique way that they made this game kind of different to other games is how they scored it. Basically, there were added point values in terms of the way in which your cone ended up being on top of another cone. So there was, let's say, a high pole. On this high pole, if at the end of the game, your cone, was the most upright top version, and then there were 4 blue ones underneath you, you basically had ownership over that pole. The more poles that your team owned, or the more poles that your highest cone was on top of, the more points you got with it. So this is sometimes what they'll do. Instead of making it unique like this in terms of the game element, they'll make it unique with the way in which you operate the points, or the way in which you play the game, not the game in and of itself, or the game elements. Now, that being said, if that doesn't make too much sense, it's okay, because you're not playing PowerPlay in 2022. You're most likely playing, hopefully you're in the present day, a game in the future. That being said, this is something that you'll see in Centrestage as well. Centrestage was an interesting game. Again, now we see an element kind of similar to the foam tile. The reason being is because this is basically a thin element, and picking up a thin element off the floor is different to picking up something like this, because you have height here and you have a geometry that's suited toward picking up. In addition, you also have a smooth kind of plastic-like feel again. So again, this was plastic, this is plastic. They haven't done the foam in 5 years since 2020. This does have, again, a little cutout on the inside, which helps grip the game element. And basically this was another pick and place game. As you come to understand, pick and place games are very popular. The pick and place game basically was you had to pick these off a stack, or you could also pick them off certain areas in the field, and you had to place it not on a flat surface. So in this game here, you pick it up like this and you place it like that. It's the same with that game over there. You pick it up like this and then you place it like that. Whereas in this game over here, you had to pick these up flat off the floor and then place it on an angled backboard. This angled backboard presented a lot of challenges. Again, because it might be easy to do with your hand, as I'll show here, but doing it with a robot presented different challenges in terms of the angle that the pixel needed to be. Because when you pick this up off the floor and then angle it, it's going to be, challenging. There were also, again, different strategic point advantages. So there was heights. The higher up the board you got, the more points you earned. And then also you could make different colors. This was probably one of the most unique point scoring advantages. If you did this on the backboard, like you'll see right here, you got an extra 10 points. So you get points for placing those 3 on the backboard, but then you just got a random bonus 10. So those bonus points was very similar to how ownership worked with the polls. You didn't do anything different to what you would normally do. You just played a strategic game in order to get bonus points. Interestingly enough, if you did this, because this white was viewed as like a neutral, that's not a bonus point. So it needed to be the colored ones. On top of that, there needed to be whites all around it to protect the bonus one. So it comes with advantages and disadvantages to play the bonus games. And every year it may change. They generally do have some kind of bonus or advantage. So that was Centrestage game element. Finally, let's move on to Into the Deep. So Into the Deep presented a unique challenge because there were these game elements here. These were, again, quite unique. We haven't really seen like a cube with little triangular cutouts in the middle. And there's a little first logo here, which was a pretty nice touch. What you could do with these game elements was you could pick these up and you could place them in medium, high, or low baskets. As you can see, that kind of height element to the pick and place game is being shown again. Now there was another challenge. You could also, this clip comes off, you could take a colored sample from the middle field, which you'll see over here. So there was a bunch of these colored ones, red, yellow, and blue. And you could place it in a special area where you have a human player do exactly that. They'll clip this and then place it back onto the field. So we haven't explained the human player. If you haven't played FTC before, the drive team, or your team that goes and plays the game, is made up of 4 people. You'll typically have 2 drivers. You'll have 1 kind of drive coach. This can be, it's usually a student who will help guide and direct the strategy of the game, but it can be an adult as well. And then you'll have a human player. The human player sits usually in a corner, and they will interact with the game in order to help you score points. So this was the way in which they interacted this time. So basically they would kind of have these clips with them already outside the field. The robot would come, drop it into a certain area, and they would clip it on like this. Once they clipped it on, you were able to then take this game element, which is very, very different to this one. This was called a sample, and this is now called a specimen. And then the specimen was able to be hung on a pole. Hanging it on the pole got you 2 extra points than just dropping this or this in a basket. So this was a unique game because, again, there were 2 different types of scoring methods. Whereas in these games, you just picked up these and put them in one object. Same with this, you picked it up and put it in one structure. So that's the way this game was unique. Now, just to not confuse you, there were also human players for all of the other games. So for the rings over there, the way in which the rings were dropped onto the field was done by a human player. For Freight Frenzy, there was a spinning wheel with a duck. I'll explain what miscellaneous challenges are, but the human player was a miscellaneous challenge. It wasn't relevant to the cycling game elements. For the PowerPlay, the human player was able to basically put these on the field, which is typically how it works. Same with these 2 games over here. So they were basically, you just place, the human player just places the elements on the field for these games. Okay, so we've basically gone through all of the games from the past 5 years and understood the game elements, and probably also a little bit about how the game worked, how to score points. Alright, so that was probably a lot of information to digest, especially if you're new to FTC and you haven't really seen any of those games in the past. Basically, you don't need to memorize those games. You don't need to kind of go and understand past game elements or understand things like geometry or material. That's not the intention. The point of looking at those past games is to understand patterns and trends, because basically everything in life where there's repetition, even if there's unique elements to certain games, there will always be patterns and trends. The number one pattern or trend is the type of game. There are, broadly speaking, two types of games that we've seen from 2024 all the way back to 2020, and in fact, the further on back you go, they mostly fit into these two categories. The first category is pick and shoot games, or in other words, shooting games. So the only game that we saw from the past 5 years do this is 2020. So in this game, you had to pick these up and shoot them. Interestingly enough, as we said, this is a rare type of game. These are typically the most fun to watch, but they're also the most risky, and there's a lot of risk mitigation that has to go in place to play this game. That's why you probably don't really see this game that often. If you do see this game though, definitely enjoy that season as much as you can, because it doesn't last. Shooting games are not common at all. The second type of game, and this is probably the one that you already know, is pick and place games. So I basically explained this. Pick and place games are very, very simple. You pick up an object and you place it somewhere. You come back and you pick up another object that was exactly the same as the one you picked up in terms of the geometry, in terms of the size. The color might be slightly different, but you end up placing it anyways. So the most conventional example of this was 2022/23 PowerPlay. In PowerPlay, you had a stack of these, like we said, you had to pick them up and place them. This was then just repeated over and over and over and over and over again. Now, there were kind of miscellaneous challenges, which we'll get into in a little bit, but the basic idea was the bulk of your points were scored by doing the same action repeatedly, over and over and over again. Now, this was an example of a conventional pick and place game because you just picked one of these up and placed them. The orientation of the cone was usually the same. Now, this is important. Let's say your hand is the robot here, or my hand is the robot. You would pick this object up, and then the orientation, as we can see, it's flat here, it's flat there. We'd definitely lift it off the floor to drive it around and then kind of go somewhere. And then if we have a lift, again, like an elevator or some kind of elevation mechanism, you would lift it up higher and higher to the point where it's probably outside the screen now, and then you'd place it onto the pole. At no point did this angle ever change, right? Because angle changes bring in more complexity to the design. That's why this was a fairly simple and straightforward to understand pick and place game. This game ended up being kind of unique because of the way in which it was scored. So basically there were two main strategies with this. As I said in the kind of previous section, the more poles you owned, and you own poles by putting your cone at the end of the game, so at the end of 2.5 minutes, if your red color was at the top compared to the other blue colors, which might have been underneath the stack, you own that pole, you get more points. There was also something called a circuit, which is basically if you designed your game or you played your game in a way where there was a straight line from one diagonal to the other, and you could make, it could be like by a straight line, you had to connect different poles together. It was a bit confusing. It still is now. But the idea was if you had the circuit, you would get an extra 20 points as well. None of that affects the basic idea of how your robot operates. You still have to make a robot that picks this up, takes it, lifts it higher, and drops it down. The way in which the scoring and the uniqueness was done was through kind of the strategy that you played. Your strategy can increase the number of points you score, but different games have different levels of strategy playing. So for example, the strategy of this game was actually pretty like, there's heavy strategy involved in terms of whether you want to go around and score more, own more poles, or whether you want to go around and just put them all on the same high pole and just max out one pole. That happened, and actually one of the poles fell, and then teams kind of avoided doing too high. An example of a game that didn't have that much strategy involved, and it was just a straightforward process, was probably the shooting game. So going back to Ultimate Goal, you just picked the three of these up and then you shot them into the high basket. If you could shoot them into the middle, chances are you could just lift up the angle of your shooter and then shoot them into the high one. And that's basically what happened. There wasn't that much involved in terms of how the drivers operated the game. It was just pick up three, shoot 3, go back, pick up 3, shoot 3. If you could do that, you were going to win a lot of games because a lot of teams weren't able to shoot. It was quite a difficult season for rookie teams, and that's from experience because we were a rookie team when we did that game, and it was tough. This is a video of what our robot looked like kind of a day before our competition, but a rookie season is like that. And that's why this video is here to help you out, to kind of avoid, or not avoid, but go into a competition or go into a season knowing certain things about games. Now, you're probably thinking, what are the chances of it being a shooting game? Quite low. What are the chances of it being a pick and place game? Relatively high. That being said, this video does not guarantee that next year or the year after will be a pick and place game. The chances are that it will most likely be a pick and place game just because of over the past 5 years, 4 of them, so 80% have been pick and place games. 1 of them has been shooting, and you probably have to go back a number of years before you find the one that's shooting as well after that. Now, although it will generally be a pick and place game, again, the way in which the game element is designed, so if it's a flat object, it's very different to picking up kind of a tall cone, right? In the same way where we have this, this was also a traditional pick and place game because without this element here, you just pick these up and put them into high baskets, basically equivalent to this game here. But they added the element of the specimen, right? So when you put this on, picking up this element was slightly different to picking it up without this. That brings in additional levels of complexity. So yes, pick and place games are generally the pattern and trend, and you will most likely play one if you do FTC for long enough, or even for a year or two. But the way in which the game is designed will be slightly different. Okay, now, if you've done a game before, so if you've played any of these games, you're probably thinking, this guy, he's missed a few things. And the reality is I have hidden or not explained a number of things in certain games. So we'll go back to this one. The most recent game as of this video is being released was Into the Deep 2024. So in this game, I've explained how the game element works. So there were kind of 2 types of game elements. There was this specimen here, and then you could also take this off, or this was the kind of the way it was played normally without the game element. In addition to game elements, there were also what we call miscellaneous challenges. So miscellaneous challenges or miscellaneous tasks, sometimes we just call them miscellaneous as well. Basically, imagine you were playing a game like this one, and a robot just kind of picks this one up, places it, and goes back, and for 2.5 minutes, that's all it does. That would be kind of boring. And in fact, First agrees. So the FTC game designers, they're called the Game Design Committee, the GDC. They agree as well, and so for every game, they will add miscellaneous challenges to make typically the end of the game fun and exciting to watch. Miscellaneous tasks are typically random, so every year it changes, and there's really no way to predict what the miscellaneous challenge will be. But one thing that we can say is that the miscellaneous challenge doesn't actually equivalent to a significant amount of points. It might add, 20 or 30 points, but matches at nationals or, at a reasonably competitive tournament, they do get up to 150 to 200 points, or even higher if we're talking about, world championships. So the miscellaneous challenges, they're at the very least, they do add bonus points, but they're not the main kind of idea. That's why understanding the game elements and understanding how repetitive the tasks will be, that's kind of the main challenge that you should aim to achieve. But they will add miscellaneous challenges to every season to generally go back and add some level of interest or intrigue to the end of the game. Now, I could go back and again explain from 2020 to 2025 all the miscellaneous challenges for every game, but that would be not very efficient. Instead, I've broken up all of the miscellaneous challenges into 3 rough sections. So the first miscellaneous challenge is hanging. This has been done in 2024 Into the Deep, and also 2023 Centrestage. Basically, hanging involves the robot lifting itself up off the ground using some kind of pole. So the robot might have like a claw system or a winch. It will hook onto like a pole, and then it has to fully lift itself up off the ground. If at the end of the match the robot is hanging, so it's off the ground by this much, even just a smidge so that the wheels are not touching, then they score bonus points at the end. This was actually a very unique challenge because it seems very difficult at the start, but once you kind of understand mechanisms and how certain mechanisms with high torque help you do this, it becomes a lot easier to design for this kind of challenge. That being said, it's still very difficult. So the second challenge that we'll explain is called capping. So capping, it's not the slang, it's the literal definition of putting a cap onto something. It was done in this game, so 2022 PowerPlay. Basically, at the end of the match, you would have, all of these cones laid out across all of the poles. You could then, the human player could put this on top of another pole. So this is what's called the cap. It was basically just colored either red or blue. So I'll show an example of that here. And then basically you would put a structure on top of an element to score more points. Very simple, but it adds a level of intrigue again, because this was, again, like 20 points, I think. It was a fairly significant amount of points that was added, but it added a level of interest. Now, the last challenge, there's no real name for this because it's a category I've made. I've just called it yeeting. Yeeting is a word actually that's defined in FTC as giving some kind of force or trajectory to something beyond gravity. So if I were to throw this, it just hit the floor. I just yeeted it, right? Whereas if I just drop this, we don't call that yeeting. Now, the games that I would classify that had miscellaneous yeeting challenges were 2023/2024. So in Centrestage 2023, you literally had to make a paper plane, a normal paper plane, and then yeet it from the back of the field across, over, outside the field. This was an interesting miscellaneous challenge. You'd think the further you yeet the thing, the more points you get, but I believe this posed a safety risk, and also it's not as much of an engineering challenge as what they did, which was the closer you got it beyond the field wall, that was the most amount of points. So there was zone 1, I think it was 30 points. And then if you did it in zone 2, that was 20, and then zone 3 was 10. If you tried to yeet it or shoot it, and it didn't go outside the field wall, that was 0. So most of the teams would aim for 20 or 30 points. So that was one example of yeeting, probably my favorite. Another example, we'll look back at Ultimate Goal. There were these kind of wobble goal-like structures. So I'll put a picture of it here because I don't have one. These kind of like mushrooms upside down, and they used to wobble. The idea of this was that you could put these rings on them for more points, but not many teams really did that. But the miscellaneous challenge was if you picked up that upside down mushroom and then yeeted it outside the field wall, you'd get a bonus amount of points as well. This challenge was also pretty difficult because it wobbled and it could fall. So you had to place it with some kind of care. That adds time. So if it takes you, for example, 30 seconds to pick it up and then place it carefully, is it worth those bonus points if you could just shoot more of these rings into the top? That's what miscellaneous challenges add strategy in. So it kind of depends. If you want to put worth toward those challenges, you have to do them fast enough for them to make sense. So the final example from the past 5 years that I say would fall into yeeting were these rubber ducks. Basically, you had this like little turntable in the corner of the field. Again, very random. On these turntables, the human player could put these baby ducks. So the idea is if you could rotate that turntable far enough, all the ducks would fall off. They'd be yeeted onto the field. For every duck that fell off, it was a significant amount of points again. It was like 10 points. By the way, like scoring these were not worth that much, but teams would drop them and then they would have the option to score them as well, because then they have more game elements on the field. So that's kind of a final example of yeeting. If you spin the turntable hard enough, they would literally go flying. But if you spun it too fast, it would, instead of going inside the field, it would go outside the field. Again, another interesting challenge with yeeting. So, miscellaneous challenges. To be fair, it could change every year, but generally hanging has been, for the past 2 years, it's quite successful. Every year teams get better and better at it, and there are mechanisms being produced and developed and designed that you can look at to take inspiration from. That being said, capping was also very popular. It was not only in this game here, but in some of the previous games going back more than 5 years. And then, to be honest, the yeeting one, it's kind of like a miscellaneous category of the miscellaneous challenge. We don't really know what it might be, but the central idea is taking something and either putting it outside the field or bringing it inside the field by throwing it. By now, you've probably taken in a lot of information, and much of this you might have already forgotten. And again, that's okay, because this video went from the start to the end of what an FTC game is defined by. And every year it's different. So once your season comes out, or if it's already come out, everything I've said probably does make sense because there's a game element as part of the challenge, there's a miscellaneous challenge as part of the challenge, as part of the game, and there's some kind of cycling or repeated action involved that the robot has to do. Most likely, with the game element, there's also kind of a level or a tier. So there'll be a low level, a mid level, and a high level, and you'll need some kind of elevation mechanism to pick up the object or an arm and score it on either the middle or the high compared to getting the least amount of points if you keep it on the low. Now, I would recommend watching this video a few times and definitely delving into some of the games I mentioned, especially any of the ones that interest you. So, for example, if you really like the Ultimate Goal game, just go back, type in FTC Ultimate Goal, and then you'll see a bunch of videos of some of the top robots that were made, and you go and understand like what makes a really competitive robot by looking at some of the really good robots from the past years. Actually, throughout this video, I've put in snippets of some of the best robots demonstrating it, so you've already got that information in your head, and that's really the point of this whole video. You will most likely forget a lot of what you've just learned, but when you're asked a question, or when you see something online, you'll go back and think, oh yeah, I know that. Like that's in your subconscious memory now. So you don't have to have this at the front of your mind, but definitely all of this information should be planted at the back. And if you don't think that's really gone through, watch it again, understand it again, and try to kind of, understand a lot of what's going on. If there's anything that doesn't really make sense, feel free to drop a comment. We can kind of help answer any of the questions that you have. So the final section of this video, again, by now, if you feel like you've gotten too much information, that's fine. You can watch this later. But I want to explain the basic idea of different robots that different teams make. Not the actual specifics of the robot, but the trends that we see from the robot. So we've analyzed the trends from the game elements and the games. The other element to it is the actual robot. So there are, generally speaking, three kinds of robots that all teams will make. There are non-functional robots at competition, so teams may generally not have had enough time or enough resources or skills to build a functional robot. So it may drive around, but it doesn't pick anything up, it doesn't drop anything off. They don't score points. Usually this is limited because in every game they'll provide some easy way to score points like pushing, but we generally still classify those as not really functional because the main mechanisms that they may have tried to make aren't functional. That's the first type. The second type is functional robots. Functional robots that work, but perhaps not fast enough to really be competitive. So you may be able to pick this one up and drop it off, but it doesn't really work as fast as you possibly can. Now, a good example of this is one of the robots that our teams made back for this game. We were able to pick this up, we were able to drop it off. It was a functional robot. And at our first competition, so the qualifiers, the regionals, it was pretty good. At nationals, it was okay, but it didn't really compare to some of the other robots that were crazy. I'll show an example of a team called RoboKings. You've probably already heard of them. They were really dominant that year entirely. And a good example of how you can compare a functional robot to the third type, which is an optimized robot. An optimized robot is basically a functional robot, but they've optimized the mechanisms in a way where it's an extremely fast cycle time robot. So just to explain cycle times again, for this game here, you pick this object up and you put it on a pole. If it took you 20 seconds to do that, and there's a robot on the other side of the field where it takes them 5 seconds, they will score 4 times as many points as you within a 2.5 minute match from the rough calculations. There may be different averages involved and intricacies, but the general idea is that robot has 4 times the performance of your robot. That's what an optimized robot is. And generally speaking, the line between a functional robot and an optimized robot is a little bit blurry because you might not know what competition looks like before you go. Like you don't know what robots are going to be there. You don't know if you have something that's more functional or something that is highly optimized and functional. That's what FTC is all about. So a lot of the time you'll see functional robots and optimized robots. In this the next 2 videos, I'm going to try and explain the process it takes to go from functional to optimized. Because at the very least, your challenge and your goal should be for your team to build a functional robot, especially if you're in your rookie season. Doing that in and of itself is like a big success. In being able to take it from functional to optimized, That's something that takes time and years of practice. However, if you are early in your season and you're watching this perhaps in February, knowing that kickoff is all the way in September, you have 6 or 7 months to develop your skills, to develop an optimized robot. And the final thing I want to explain is that it's not just kind of static, it's a spectrum. A robot can be functional at regionals or your qualifiers, and then 2 weeks later, that robot can be extremely optimized by nationals because you've developed it over that period of time and you've added more programming, you've added more fine tuning. You've basically optimized it in a way that makes sense and adds more speed and increases your overall score. So typically at regionals, you will generally see functional robots even from the best teams because they haven't really had the time to optimize it yet. But their designs are able to be optimized because they've thought about how an optimized robot should look at nationals, developed and designed it. When regionals comes, they know that they've got something functional, but the end goal might be nationals or the world championships, all the way in April. So that's kind of how it develops. It's definitely a scale, and it's not even like a linear scale. A lot of the time, it can be quite significant how fast your cycle time gets. At the start, it would be quite slow because you start off with nothing. The more and more you build up your robot, the faster and faster you might be able to score points. And then when you add programming and different kinds of advanced programming techniques, parting algorithms, state machines, they increase your cycle time significantly. So it's not just a static line or even a linear line, it can go up quite dramatically if you learn the skills necessary to build and design and test a functional, optimized robot. So hopefully that makes sense. This is probably one of the longest videos that I've ever recorded. It's probably got an hour and a half worth of just me talking. So I don't know how long this video will be at the end. You can see that now because you're watching it. But if you made it all the way through, that is very good, perfect. Again, you can take notes, read the competition manual, go back to sections that you don't quite understand, and I've added chapters below so that you can kind of help you guide through that. And yeah. This is the first video out of 3. Hopefully at the end of this video, you've got a pretty solid understanding of how the FTC game works. And if you're in your season now, you already know the specifics of the game, so you know your element, and you may know the miscellaneous challenges, but you understand now the totality of what makes up a game. If you're not in your season, that's okay too, because you can use the past seasons to pick up and learn the patterns and trends, and you'll be well adjusted by the time your season kicks off. In the next video, we're going to be explaining what it takes to actually build, design, and in other words, develop a competitive, optimized robot. So it will go through the functional parts to create a functional robot, but hopefully also give you some tips and tricks and the procedures in order to build an optimized robot. All right, that's been it. See ya.